Okay, I think we're recording. One last thing is just a heads up on our next two webinars. Natural Gas Vehicles of America, Daniel Gage, their president, will be our featured speaker for our July webinar. That's on July, I want to say 17th. No, July 20th. And then we have One Future, Jim Keebler, their executive director, for our August webinar on August 17th, talking about One Future's efforts and their successes to date and what they see as the future. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, Danielle, and give you just a minute to bring your slide deck up. And you know how to work this stuff. So I'm gonna, the floor is yours. And thank you, Danielle, for joining us today.
Wonderful. I appreciate the offer to come and talk about this. This is actually, I think, quite an interesting time for me to be doing this presentation for you all. I actually just came back from the EEI annual conference, where there's really great discussions around decarbonization trends and how fuels and gas will enable the decarbonization trends that we expect to see over the next decade. So that's a little bit of what I'm going to talk about, and really excited to be here with this group today. So just to get started, I will do the 30-second introduction for those of you that don't know Guidehouse. Hopefully many of you do at this point, but Guidehouse is a brand that is about 5 years old. It came together as PwC spun off their public sector business and then acquired Navigant Energy, where most of our energy team comes from, and many people recognize that name. We now, the slide says 15,000 plus employees. We now are over 17,000 with a few additional companies coming into our ranks. We are a global company, and we have about 2,500 of those individuals focused in the energy and sustainability space. So just giving you a little bit of insight into where I come from, and just a little bit of a background on myself. I actually am just passing my 10 years with the Guidehouse team and previously Navigant Energy team. I lead currently our energy system decarbonization team globally. So that includes our focus around low carbon technologies, and primarily at this point, hydrogen and other low carbon fuels. Our low carbon pathways team, which really looks at kind of decade-long modeling into the future, looking at how energy systems will be restructured as we move forward with decarbonization trends. And much of my work today is working with gas utilities, trying to understand regulatory and strategy kind of components of decarbonization. And have been involved not only in greenhouse gas assessments and climate reports, but also in building out reports that have gone into rate cases and regulatory discussions to move forward the discussion around the role of fuels in decarbonization. In addition, some of the work that I've done around at the nationwide level includes work with the American Gas Foundation, to look at the role of gas in supporting the energy system from a resilience perspective, and then have worked with large corporates and cities across the US and across the world to set their decarbonization targets. So thinking about what some of those consumers are looking for as they make their plans towards decarbonization. So with that, I will just get us kicked off around the topic of today. As I said, what I want to talk a little bit about is what we see as the real pathways and opportunity and some of the challenges, right, for the gas system as a whole as we move towards a decarbonized landscape. And I'll start just with this, this basic kind of perspective that as we see the energy transition move forward, we really are seeing a transformation of the kind of utility mandate. Historical mandates really were to provide safe, reliable, affordable energy, and this is something that utilities were very good at and had a well-built and low-risk kind of business model for delivering this energy. As we move forward with today, we're starting to see additional components being added to that historical mandate. decarbonization or clean energy is a key component of that, as well as focusing on not just reliability, but resilience against major kind of climate events. And we could even add some other, topics around kind of expected around digitalization and such to this storyline. So there's really a need for utilities to think closely about the business model that they are delivering with, and whether there's changes that are needed to continue to deliver energy while mitigating risk around the business. So this is really kind of what we are going to speak to today. And the way I like to approach this is I like to step back. And while many of us work in the energy industry and are, dealing with the day-to-day kind of perspectives of our clients, our customers, it's hard to keep track of all the trends that are going on in the industry and what we're seeing in terms of decarbonization. So I'm going to step back and just look at the national perspective. Decarbonization is occurring when we think about the energy-related carbon dioxide emissions in the US. This has primarily been driven by the move from coal to natural gas on the electric side, as well as some of the energy efficiency components that have made the system more productive in terms of the energy that is used in supply. And, we are seeing a general trend towards decarbonization. 2023, we're expecting to see 3% below 2019 emissions and 17% below the 2007 peak. So there is a trend down in decarbonization at the national level. Again, this is focusing just on the energy-related carbon dioxide emissions. This is not a holistic view of all carbon dioxide emissions, though energy makes up a good portion of that. For the US, it usually sits somewhere between 80 to 90% of total emissions are energy related, but there are things outside of energy related, things like emissions from wastewater, from agricultural and land use changes. So just making sure that we are centered around what this is. And then just at the national level, and we'll dive more into what's going on in the Pacific Northwest, right? We are seeing significant kind of incentivization of a continued move in this space. And that includes, right, what the Biden administration has set in terms of targets for carbon emissions, the IRA and IIJA providing significant incentives, billions of dollars out there to encourage clean energy technologies. The CHIPS and Science Act is really focused on some of the technologies that are needed to support this continued movement, and then again an increased awareness on extreme weather at the individual and customer level that is driving some of the resilience requirements across the organization. So all of these are kind of items that are continuing to move this trend forward. But let's look a little bit at what's going on in the West. And I think you all are very well aware of the trends and the continued push in policy, right, to decarbonize the Western states. Carbon pricing and kind of cap and trade policies have been a key component in the Pacific Northwest recently. We, see this push as well from Canada. We have renewable portfolio, clean energy and alternative portfolio standards, so a lot of these kind of requirements that are continuing to push. But when we look at this, we say, well, what's actually going on and what is happening in these states? And I want to take a closer look at a couple of the states as examples to say what actually is happening. So starting with Oregon, the most recent data we have from Oregon is the Oregon 2020 greenhouse gas emissions report. There is some more detailed information from the recent, some of the recent legislation that shows sectors of the economy, but as a whole state, this is the most recent data that we have. And this is before the impacts of some of the current policy in terms of where the projected emissions were headed. But well, we see there is kind of like a peak similar to the time frame of the national peak for Oregon. The expectation is that Oregon will not achieve the current targets that have been set. The expectation is that by 2035, Oregon will achieve a 45% reduction below 1990 levels, and by 2050, an 80% reduction below 1990 levels. Our current projections are showing that the state is set to miss that emissions reduction goal in 2035 by a pretty significant amount, and by 2050 even more. We are seeing, this gap will reduce with some of the recent legislation that has come through in Oregon. But really, there is still a pretty significant gap between where the state is today and where the expectation or the goals have been set for emissions reduction. And this is not an uncommon situation, right? Nevada is another example of a state that does have some emissions reductions goals, 28% by 2025, 45% by 2030, below the 2005 levels, and a goal to be net zero by 2050, right? So these red lines on the graph show where those goals are. Again, there was a peak around 2005, which is why the goals have been set at that point. But we've seen a reduction since then and a pretty flat lining in Nevada. The expectation is that Nevada will be about 6% short of the 2025 reduction target and about 21% short of the 2030 reduction target, looking at current projections on emissions. Again, this data comes from the 2021 Nevada climate report. So there are a few pieces that have moved, but again, right, not quite on track for those emissions reductions. And then we pull up California, which is another example, and often one that's pointed to as an example of kind of how emissions reductions have been able to be achieved on a pretty significant scale. So California's emissions today remain below 1990 emissions levels, and the state is on track to meet its 2020 greenhouse gas emissions target. That said, the 2030 target, which goes further in terms of emissions reductions and actually starts to bend the curve down, is going to be incredibly challenging to meet. Most of the projections basically show that the state will not meet those 2030 goal. So you can see that yellow line is the 2030 goal. The projected emissions reductions continue at a pretty steady pace and will definitely be significantly short of that 2030 goal based on current projections. So what I'm doing to try to pull this up is really just give a kind of a status update in terms of where do these goals sit and how are we doing against them? You'll see in every case, there has been a peak. We have seen emissions declining and, since the early 2000s, but we have significant additional kind of movement that needs to go to get to these 2030, 2040, 2050 goals. And the current projections show most geographies not having the policies in place, right, to support significant or achievement of those goals at this time. So I'll pause there for a moment and just remind too, if you have questions as I'm going through this, please do drop them in the chat, and I'm more than happy to address them as we go forward. So I think the key thing is what is really achievable. So I'll pause a little bit on this and talk a little bit about what this means. This is going back to our our emissions, US net greenhouse gas emissions. So this is looking at whole economy, not just energy emissions, but again, the trend is very much the same. We've seen that early 2000 peak. We have been progressively moving down from that. You can see the sharp dip that occurred right around COVID when everyone stopped, using their cars every day, and we started to see more people working from home and truthfully keep key components of the economy shut down for periods of time, right? Globally, we saw that greenhouse gas emissions dropped 4.6% in 2020, but we have already seen a rebounding to basically pre-pandemic levels. So this kind of overall peak, if we look from the top down to 2019, which is kind of just before the effect of the pandemic, US net emissions declined 13%, and the energy sector, as we talked about, was the primary reason for those total emissions reductions. And when we look towards, kind of where the goals are for the country, our 2030 goal is to reduce emissions 50% below 2005 levels. That would basically require a sustained annual emissions reduction similar to what we saw during the pandemic to achieve that 2030 goal, right? So we want to just put this in context in terms of the speed and the possibility of this being achieved.
So Danielle, I have a couple questions. I think they're related really, but one question is, with several states missing their goals, what are the options to reach those goals? And two, are there penalties if when emissions reduction goals aren't met in the various states that have them?
Yeah, really good question. So many of the states that have goals do not necessarily have penalties assigned with them. We have seen a few come in, and often they're financial penalties, and they're often linked to something to cap and trade type legislation that does have some financial component associated with not meeting the goals. The challenge is that it's really the individual actors that are tied to meeting those goals, because that's the leverage. It is not the state that needs to meet them, it's the individual actors. So that's the leverage that the state can kind of apply from a financial perspective through basically a carbon price. That said, you can see that many of these goals are, many of these states are not lined up to achieve the goals. In the US, well, we've seen movement with new policy is still behind in terms of achieving the 2030 goal. And this really comes down to a political discussion of, are state legislatures, state governors really on board with driving forward the incentives, and some of the penalties, right, the carrots and sticks that are needed to achieve these goals? And are these just goals, are these just lip service, or is there something behind that? So hopefully that helps a little bit. I see there might have been another comment here around the fact that jurisdictions don't adjust for population growth when calculating their greenhouse gas emissions. Is that true across the board? So what I will say is that this really depends on the type of greenhouse gas emissions calculation that is going on in a jurisdiction and the type of goal that is set. For example, right, if we look at the goals that we just talked through, or even the US goal, right, a 50% below 2005 levels, that's what would be called an absolute emissions target, right? So regardless of population, the goal is to reduce emissions to a certain amount, right? Versus a emissions reduction that is done on a per capita basis, or say per production basis. So we see some, which is basically an intensity goal. So we see some companies looking at setting a goal that is basically a carbon intensity of the energy that they provide. And in that case, you are making a adjustment basically for growth just based on the type of goal. There is a process called rebaselining, which sometimes will backcast and go back in time to say if you change population or change your environment dramatically. That is mostly used with corporations when they are basically either purchasing or divesting a new portion of their business. That said, the climate science, right, that most of this is based on really sets an absolute target across the world for emissions reduction. So even if you are growing in population, the climate science sets an absolute goal. And so if you truthfully are following the climate science, you are not rebaselining based on growth, well, you should. It just truthfully makes it harder to get there. So, but there's a lot of differentiation in terms of how the goals are set. Great questions. And I think there's a lot of, a lot of challenges around, how these are set, and truthfully, the fine print language matters a lot when we're looking at climate goals. So when we look at the US and kind of the ability to reach the 2030 target, this was actually a study that was put out just after the IIJA and IRA were announced. What we knew just from current policies was that the expectation was a 27% reduction in emissions by 2030, which still kept the US well short of the 2030 goal that has been set. The new climate policy, this assessment takes into fact if basically all incentives are used, so it doesn't account necessarily for the barriers of the use of some of those incentives, which come from, say, supply chain barriers just to get some of the clean energy technologies, cited, as well as land use, issues and all of that. But really the idea is if you were able to maximize the incentives in the new climate bill, that it would bring us quite a bit closer at a United States level of meeting that 2030 goal, but still about 8 percentage points short of getting to that 50% below. That said, there continues to be new regulation coming in. Some of the EPA rules on power plants also are going to be factored into all of this, and it starts to, as you add all of those up, move much closer towards that 2030 goal. But I think it's important to recognize the scale of change that is necessary is pretty much a sustained, basically, pathway similar to the speed of what we saw during the pandemic, is what is really being charted in these goals. Okay. And I'm seeing that there's a question came up around producing, if it's possible to produce enough offsets to cover emissions targets, even if the rules only allow for 1% of offsets. So I think it's a really good question, Rusty. There are some limitations in offsets. And again, remember that reducing emissions and meeting the goals that we see or at the state or national level really require a total emissions and reductions. When we talk about offsets, the reason that we use offsets is because we are basically incenting reduction of emissions in a place that is not the exact location where the emissions are coming from to be able to produce those. There are some significant concerns around how realistic offsets really are and how much you can generate. There is no way you can generate enough offsets or enough, kind of negative emissions solutions to offset your way out of the problem. Most of the projections show that you might be able to offset the last about 10 to 20% of emissions with offset projects, but you have to get to reduction levels of 80 to 90% of kind of your goal before offsets can finish off the rest. So, I'm throwing up here a slide that really starts to just envision what would a pathway look like for decarbonizing a natural gas pipeline system. This is a quick sketch from our team as we look at some of the technical feasibility of the solutions, what might be available today, and how do you kind of stack these emissions reductions options together to start to look at a decarbonized pipeline system. As you'll see, we kind of pull together a set of different types of technologies. We basically focus these on 4 different categories, with offsets you'll see being the final and the very last bit of that pipeline system, but energy efficiency and electrification being a key component of this again, and I will go into more detail as I get through this, we see gas as a significant and important solution in the future energy system. We also see less gas in the future energy system. And truthfully, gas becomes an enabler. And what we have going through the pipes is fewer molecules, but more valuable molecules. So, you see a significant amount of kind of energy efficiency and electrification occurring that starts to change the way in which that the molecules are moving through that pipeline. Carbon capture being a key component of this, including not only the capture that could occur at, say, an industrial site, but also the capture that could occur on the pipeline, and then through direct air capture, which is basically a offset solution, and depending on who owns that solution would be considered an offset or an inset to the system. We then see renewable natural gas making up about 20% of the total, and hydrogen blending being used for the final gas that is in the system. We also and in particular, this is just a vision for the current kind of natural gas pipeline system, and what we call kind of a methane system going into the future. We also see the growth of dedicated hydrogen infrastructure going towards specifically, say, industrial and large duty transportation loads, which would mean that there's a kind of a second pipeline system built in certain places where it makes sense from a supply and demand perspective. But as you start to see how this vision lays out, there are some really significant components of kind of buckets, I would say, of types of measures that are going to be used if you look at full decarbonization of the pipeline system. And so I see a couple of questions. Scott, the question around whether this includes gas used in electricity generation. I would say yes, yes, and I would say this is a really broad brush kind of vision of what this might look like. We do see in some cases, the electric generation continuing to use kind of what's on the methane pipeline and that low carbon gas that can push through. We also see some movement of electric generation going to pure play hydrogen infrastructure. So I would say yes and no, and it depends a little bit on the region that you're looking at this and the shape of that electric infrastructure in terms of how exactly that will play out. And I do see a question around the terminology of inset. So this is a new terminology that we are seeing more of in the corporate sustainability space as we start to see the discussion of offsets get a little bit more nuanced. So inset is basically an offset other than it occurs in your own supply chain. So basically, it's not something you are purchasing an offset for such that, someone else is going and doing it, but you have some control over it in your supply chain and are encouraging the development of what would be considered an offset project in your own supply chain. And truthfully, at this point, we're starting to see methodologies come out that prioritize insets in terms of value in your greenhouse gas emissions methodology over offsets. So it is something to keep your eyes on in terms of if there's opportunities to consider some sort of project that could occur in your supply chain. So let's talk a little bit about the trends and, what are some of these key energy transition pieces that are affecting decarbonization and the speed and scale at which this moves forward. I'm going to talk about 5 different trends and really look at this from a couple of different stakeholders and some of the kind of global discussion that is going on in the energy system today. So one of the things that we find is that there is a real push around the regulator and investor sentiment and more focus on climate risk and, in effect, decarbonization in the storyline. So when we look at some of the detail that is pulled together from, say, the World Economic Forum, climate change has been pulled out as one of the 4 largest global risks for businesses over the next 10 years again and again. And we're starting to see this kind of transform into the way in which money is spent. Well, it still is a smaller portion of the total market. There is significant growth in sustainable funds, and we see particular focus from investors on mitigating physical risks. So that would be the risk presented from large-scale climate events, as well as transition risks. So that is the risk related to kind of the world decarbonizing or moving around you and your business not being set up to be to deliver in that new world. This is, there's significant growth here. There's nuances to this because there's different kind of levels of what's considered a sustainable fund and how you would say money is being focused in this way. But the thing that is very, very clear when we're in the utility space is that the questions from stakeholders, particularly questions from investors in investor forums, are getting much more nuanced around climate and transition risk. We're starting to see in many cases, and not just those that have mandated decarbonization targets, questions from regulators that point to concern around some of these topics, particularly the focus on reliability and resilience that tie this all together. And we are also expecting the disclosure rules that are expected through the SEC and CSA that will be linked to the current rules that are expected out this month from the ISSB to drive more transparency around the numbers that investors and stakeholders can use to basically ask these questions and push companies on their sustainability plans. So this is something that definitely is driving decisions. There's more money focused in this area, and something that will continue to push forward the trend on decarbonization, not just across the energy space, but across corporates as a whole. We also see some, I would say, beyond kind of the investor and regulator sentiment, a just larger focus from stakeholders as a whole around decarbonization, as well as kind of global conflict sort of discussions. So these are kind of these worldwide sort of discussions that are pushing the needle and focus on decarbonization. I'm flagging 2 here, and these are kind of very different topics, but I think have a lot of similarities in terms of just what the trend is. This is an example from a lawsuit that was filed against Washington Gas and Light, where Client Earth basically alleged that Washington Gas and Light Company had falsely marketed its natural gas products as clean and sustainable. We are seeing this discussion more and more common, basically a discussion around greenwashing, and we're expecting this pressure to be significantly higher if and when the SEC rules do come into play, because there's a lot more transparency around the greenhouse gas impact of the products and services that energy companies are providing, and this is a key place where we are going to see some pressure from not just investors, but environmental stakeholders from across the board. In addition, we're seeing some of the focus on energy security drive discussions around sustainability. What's really quite interesting to me is that when the war in Ukraine occurred and we started to see the impacts from a pipeline perspective, the focus on Repower EU really got focused on domestic production and how could they replace that gas. And what it ended up doing is pushing forward targets that had been there in Europe around decarbonization 5 to 10 years faster than where those targets had been, and significantly higher numbers of renewables, energy efficiency, and a lot of focus in money going in this direction. This has two effects for us in the North American market. One, it provides a greater incentive to develop products here and ship them abroad because of the incentives in Europe. But it also, I think, is an important consideration to take into account, because while this was built, this driver was built out of a global kind of conflict situation, we also could see very similar sort of drivers coming out of major climatic events. And this discussion, when we start turning to local supply and energy security, often looks to some of the solutions that we have at our hands in the communities that we live in, and renewable energy projects, biomass projects, renewable natural gas projects that can be produced locally and in communities become get a lot of interest in these discussions. So just flagging this as kind of two different ways we are seeing these kind of larger kind of pressure from stakeholders as a whole play into the decarbonization discussion. We'll talk a little bit about what we're seeing in kind of the domestic market for low carbon fuels. Renewable natural gas is the key low carbon fuel that is being produced and sold domestically at this point. Primarily, that market is fueled by the LCFS market or kind of RINs credits that are federal and state programs, that are driving up the incentive for producing renewable natural gas. This market is still small, but it is growing dramatically. We've almost tripled the number of facilities that are in the US from 2017, and hundreds of these facilities in construction each year. Just thinking about kind of Pacific Northwest area in this, in this discussion, 2040, it's expected that the RNG production will increase 10 times again, right? This is a small market. It is not going to replace all of natural gas production, but it is a significant component and a growth opportunity that is going on in the market. And when we look at renewable natural gas, it being a drop-in fuel, ability to push through the pipeline is a very valuable opportunity, particularly when there are hard to decarbonize sectors that are connected to that pipeline, and or there's significant kind of reliability and resilience concerns in the region, that RNG becomes an incredibly valuable component of that future energy system. The one thing to keep in mind is, even if we were able to get to high levels of RNG production, pretty much produce everything that we technically could by 2040, 2050, it still would only replace about 25% of total natural gas use today. in the system. So it is, this is a solution that is not a silver bullet, will not replace everything, but it is a component of the change in the energy system, and part of the reason why I will say that, you know, the molecules that we see in the future are going to be fewer but more valuable. RNG, while we're seeing the costs come down, is very likely never to be on par with natural gas in terms of cost, just because of how it is produced, the distributed nature of it. And, you know, we do see it start to come on par when we add in incentives. But again, when you're looking from the perspective of how do I produce a decarbonized energy system for the lowest cost versus how do I produce, you know, the most inexpensive energy, regardless of decarbonization, it becomes a critical component of the system, and the growth in the market is definitely going to change the way in which it's used. In terms of kind of the low carbon fuels market, hydrogen is the other one, and the one on everyone's minds. In particular, while we were at the I was at the EEI conference earlier this week, there was an entire section of that agenda focused on hydrogen. Hydrogen is being seen as something that can not only support decarbonization of the gas system, but also the electric, you know, key component of the electric system, and a component of supporting many of the sectors that are going to have challenges decarbonizing, like industrial and large scale kind of transportation. We are expecting the prices to decline, and we are seeing the prices and you know, forecasts for those come down as we get more certainty around the electrolyzer market, around the feedstocks. And we are expecting hydrogen demand to increase significantly over the next couple of decades. The one thing that I will note, you know, carbon prices that we are seeing come in have a significant impact on hydrogen. For example, when we think about blue hydrogen, which is basically hydrogen produced by natural gas, but using carbon capture, so it has a significantly lower carbon intensity than the gray hydrogen that is used today, which is most hydrogen produced directly from natural gas, that a carbon price of about $50 per ton of CO2, which is truthfully not out of line with what we're starting to see in terms of pricing development in the Pacific Northwest with some of the cap and trade policies, is that, you know, blue becomes competitive with gray hydrogen. So it's a key driver to be focused on as we start to see some of the incentives play out, and those incentives in the IRA, we are going to likely see significant growth in the hydrogen production market in the US. You know, so those give some of the levers and the opportunities for decarbonization. One of the challenges that that we see in terms of growth is that for those companies that are in the US that are looking to decarbonize, right now the incentive structure for developing and delivering low carbon fuels in Europe is truthfully more valuable for a lot of the products. And we see the EU as a net importer currently of low carbon fuels, and that's going to create a competitive nature. So even as, you know, the markets grow in North America, you know, there is a competitive global market here that may make some of these resources you know, harder to get your hands on than we might otherwise expect. For example, Germany is an incredibly promising market for those companies that may be looking to be exporters of hydrogen. It's expected that domestic hydrogen demand in Germany will be made up by more than 80% imports by 2030. So, you know, there are going to be net importers in the EU with some pretty significant policy incentives already in place that are going to make this market more competitive.
Danielle, I have a question on that. So does does that analysis on the EU's as a hydrogen sink or low carbon sink take into account the hydrogen backbone proposal that's being and its potential?
Yeah, absolutely. So this actual work comes from our analysis, and which includes the hydrogen backbone potential. So the Guidehouse team has been the one at the front of building out that hydrogen backbone proposal in the EU, bringing together all the TSOs and producers to drive that discussion. Even as you develop that regional supply, we still see or the regional kind of network for moving hydrogen around the EU, you still see need for additional supply capabilities.
Thank you.
Great question there. Okay. Finally, I'll just speak to the discussion of resilience. And this is, I think, one of the most kind of critical components as we think about telling the story around the gas system and the value of the gas system as an enabler to the energy system going forward. When we look across all data, kind of growth, there's a significant growth of high impact weather events in the US and across the world. What this means is that we are seeing, these major events on the energy system and major impacts for communities in terms of, human life and health during this time. In many cases, as we break apart these storylines for the impact from these events, the gas system is a critical component of retaining, keeping the system online, or truthfully making it a lot less worse than it could have been in other cases. And that's critically just connected to the storage capabilities within the gas system and ability to stretch that over kind of these short periods of times where you have high impact. We can point to, different events like the polar vortex, the winter storm in Uri. A lot of these are pretty well known. I'm going to just focus on one in particular where we have some quite kind of detailed data, and one that's not often pointed to, because we often think of gas as being a key component of supporting the energy system during cold weather events. This is an example from 2020 in Southern California, where California was in the middle of its hottest August in 126 years, so severe kind of impact in terms of energy systems. They also were experiencing, that major drought and a really significant wildfire season. So as you kind of put that all together, the electric system was getting stressed under major cooling loads, and also saw reduced renewable output because of the wildfire smoke in the area, and reduced kind of hydro imports because of the drought. Right, so we were looking at basically severe multi-day climate events. And what you can actually see is this is from the Southern California system, but the natural gas system was really able to provide that broader kind of power and, prevented extensive power outages. The storage on the systems were basically pushed all the way to the edge of their capabilities. But the energy system, electric and gas, never went offline during this time. There were some interruptible customers that were not served, but you can really point, as you get into the weeds here, that it was the ability of the natural gas system to really provide this supply gap and meet the needs of peaking plants that went up to basically request the entirety of their daily supply in the course of an hour, and being able to shift that load was really the thing that kept the energy system online. So I'm going to push this as a discussion that I think needs a lot of focus from the gas system. Reliability, resilience, and gas as an enabler of energy system reliability and resilience is going to be a key focus point, and something that is really important as we move towards looking at a more decarbonized system. So when I say, what does this all mean? Well, we step back, we say, emissions are declining. We already, that's going to happen regardless of new policies. We've peaked, expectation is we will continue to decline. But I think the real question is, how do you think about this as a gas utility looking forward in this space? Truthfully, one of the challenges that gas utilities have is they have fewer cost-effective measures available in the near term than at the electric side of the system. So offsets are important, but again, communication of what those offsets are and how do you move to real decarbonization measures is going to be a critically important discussion for many who play in the gas system and are part of telling this story. The challenge that gas utilities have is that they really are in this place of fighting for survival while they're navigating some of the most kind of complex business model transitions in their history. We've had very, very much gas utilities have historically been very conservative, very kind of consistent business model, and there's going to need to be a lot of innovation to move forward with delivering a gas system that is going to look dramatically different in the next decades than it does today. And I will say, where we have seen people have success is when they maximize their no regret strategies. Sitting back and watching kind of how the world has changed has often put companies in the position of not being competitive for the few number of options that are at the table to start to move on this reduction. So what that means in terms of kind of playing the short game and ensuring success, I would say integrating low carbon fuels aggressively. Obviously still defined by the regulator in terms of what you can get cost recovery on, but integrating low carbon fuels in all cases and diversifying the portfolio has proven to be a valuable opportunity. I say consider proactively expanding the customer base. We have a whole lot of the energy system that is not currently served by regulated fuels. There are opportunities not only for electricity there, but for molecular fuel delivery through gas and low carbon fuels to decarbonize those portions of the energy system. And obviously having to put together a storyline for the regulators as to why and how to put that business case together. But there are some places where we think you can deploy capital and earn a rate of return to expand the customer base and really think about innovative opportunities. I would say for all, ensuring transparency and communication. The companies that are going to be rewarded in the transition are those that maintain the trust of all of their stakeholders, and transparency and communications is going to be key and key to that. And then the final ones are really about kind of proactive communication and not only working with your regulators, but working with peers and sharing what works. And I will say for everyone that's on this, I know not everyone is part of a gas utility, but these are going to require complex stakeholder interactions, and everyone who is benefiting from or part of the natural gas supply chain to be part of the discussion as to how these opportunities can be utilized to move forward decarbonization, and those kind of key communication across the stakeholders is going to be critical to making change happen. So I will stop there. Dan, I think I'm right about at the end of the hour, but open to any other questions if there is anything.
Yeah, take a minute or two if you have any closing questions. We are pretty close. Danielle, thank you for a terrific and comprehensive presentation. Sure appreciate it. I loved your last bullet, which seems to imply that, trade associations that engage in helping their members communicate with each other. I'm raising my hand. I'm not sure if you can see that, but the Gas Association certainly does that with its members, and so we appreciate you putting that on there. Any other questions? Let me see if I've got one or two more here. Nope, just lots of thanks here, Danielle. So I will thank you, and again, just a reminder, the slides will